Okay, we might get started. Still a few people joining, but as long as James is happy to keep letting people in while they pile in. Thanks everyone for joining. I'll start with my standard apology. I think the last project sharing session we had, I managed to schedule it with an Indonesian public holiday, and today it's a PNG public holiday. So not very good planning on my part. Apologies to our PNG colleagues, but we'll make sure you get access to the slides and the recording. So today's session is on the topic of localization. So clearly something that I guess all of our projects have been forced to think about as part of their pivot strategies in response to COVID. I think if we're trying to come up with a list of positives resulting from COVID-19, it's a pretty short list. Maybe the chance to wear tracksuit pants in the office or at work would be one, but otherwise, another would probably be the broader shift we've seen towards increased use, responsibility, authority of local staff, leaders, partners on our programs, and just how effective that's proven to be in many instances. I don't think it's controversial to say that there's a common prevailing view amongst donors and contractors that localization generally requires some sort of compromise or trade-off with things like quality and risk, and that perception has been one of the main constraints to more locally led approaches on donor programs. So hopefully through the COVID pivot, we've been able to generate more evidence, more confidence around when more localized approaches are effective. How donors and contractors can better support them, the changing role of international advisors in that context, and so on. So hopefully that's a discussion and a shift that we can keep some momentum around as we slowly move past COVID and restrictions on international travel. But of course, there are many projects that have been thinking about these things for a long time and well before COVID hit us. So we're going to hear from a couple of those today, a couple of our specific projects that have been managed and supported through a Cardno contract to date, but are transitioning to sort of genuinely locally led programs and structures with very minimal, if any, role for an international contractor. So we're going to hear from Michelle Reddy, who was the fund manager for the Fiji Women's Fund, but has very recently become the fund manager for the Women's Fund Fiji, which might sound like a very minor name change, but it actually is a very significant and hard-won achievement. So Michelle will speak about that journey. Welcome, Michelle. And then we'll hear from Tara Chetty, Partnerships Lead for Pacific Women, a program that Cardno's been supporting for, I think, nearly 10 years. And has championed a range of interesting localization strategies in that time, but will soon transition also to become a regional intergovernmental organisation. So Tara will talk us through that evolution. So welcome to you, Tara. And yes, we deliberately kept today's session to just 2 presentations to allow plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So as per previous sessions, feel free to post questions in the chat along the way, and we can address them after each presentation. But also, we'd really like to hear from other projects and staff about their own sort of localization challenges and experiences. I know there are lots of projects that have made a lot of headway in that space, and others where progress and results have been very mixed for a range of reasons. So please do jump in and share with the group when you get a chance. Okay, so we didn't actually agree who was going to speak first, but Michelle, you're first on the list. Are you happy to speak first?
Yeah, I'm happy for Tara to start, but either way, I'm good.
Okay. No, either way. Tara, you want to kick off?
Yes, typical Michelle. We work together quite often. This is not unlike her. No
Good
problem,
delegation.
Michelle.
Good delegation.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to see if I can successfully share my presentation. Just a moment. There we go. You should be seeing it now. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, great. All right. Well, good afternoon from Suva, everyone. Despite my replacement laptop giving me mood lighting, it's actually a lovely sunny afternoon here. So hopefully you can see me through the murky camera and more importantly, the presentation. So the question about localization gave, I think, both of us a lot to think about in really different ways for Michelle and I. Pacific Women is quite a broad and complex program working across a really diverse regional context. So what does localization look like in a regional program is an interesting question. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our program. So Pacific Women, which Cardno has worked with from inception, so prior to really the awarding of the formal contract from 2013, is a very large portfolio of programs. In fact, it's one of the largest gender equality programs globally because it works with over 160 partners. There's over 170 initiatives, and it formally works across the 14 countries that are covered by the Pacific Islands Forum. But it is actually I guess more substantially working in 6 or 7 of those countries. It's a long-term commitment as well, up to a decade, although the transition to Pacific Women is happening sort of 6 months earlier perhaps than originally envisaged because of the COVID context. And I think it's really ended up being in that way a really good example of a transition because there's been a lot more lead-in time for it. I work with the support unit, the Pacific Women Support Unit, which Cardno has the contract for, and it provides support to this portfolio of partnerships, working closely with DFAT, with a select range of the grant partners, but doing MEL, learning, convening, communications across the entire breadth of the partnerships. The program currently is working to 4 outcomes. So the largest area of investment is in ending violence against women. There's a lot of interest in the area of women's economic empowerment. There's work emerging on leadership and decision making because the Pacific remains the region with the lowest levels of women's representation at the national parliamentary level. We also have an area of work called enhancing agency and building an enabling environment, which is, yes, a bit of a catch-all, but also is really speaking to that, the legislative environment for gender equality, the building of coalitions for change, partnerships, things like that. And in fact, the support for the Fiji Women's Fund, which you're going to hear about, is supported through that enabling environment part of our work. So I did mention that it has also been a great incubation space for some wonderful initiatives. One that's directly implemented by the support unit is Pacific Girl. It's a 6-country, $4.5 million program that is, I guess, falls under this broader Pacific Women program, which has a total value of 320 million over 10 years. The Pacific Girl is over 3 years, 4.5 million. And it works across the 6 countries to support adolescent girls to reach their full potential. It works primarily with civil society organizations and is guided by the voices of adolescent girls themselves. There's also the Balance of Power program that's been incubated, and that's focused on women's leadership at all levels and creating pathways for more influential women's political leadership. There's also the Fiji Women's Fund as it was, and now the Independent Women's Fund Fiji, which is on a very exciting journey, and Michelle will tell us more about that soon. So that these are some of the discrete projects or, programs within the program that have been incubated. So where to from here, and what is this localization project that we're under at the moment? I should just pause briefly at this point to say the concept of localization is problematic for some people for different ways. We heard Mark allude to kind of the fears and the concerns about a kind of shift to localization. But for others, working within the development sector, there is a concern that it really simplifies or downgrades the role of kind of Pacific peoples, African peoples within initiatives to kind of improve gender equality or other ways. So in other words, it creates a false idea that this is something new that's happening, the involvement of locals in development or locally led development. But having said that, I think it's still really an important moment, given this COVID context, to unpack it a bit and to look at what have been some of the new moves, but also what is the existing localization that has been supported, and I think particularly supported by Cardno in recent times. So the moment that's happening for us now is this transition from Pacific Women to the drastically differently named Pacific Women Lead. Pacific Women, you remember, was a 10-year program, and now this new iteration of Australia's commitment to gender equality in the region is a 5-year program of $170 million, and it's committed. The commitment now is to be much more led by the Pacific. So here, I think we come to what are we really saying when we use the word localization? It's not so much that you're involving locals in senior roles for the first time, but rather we're talking about a shift in power and a shift in the power to decide or set the priorities or set the agenda for some of this development work happening in the region. And in this move from Pacific Women to Pacific Women Lead, there is a genuine attempt, which is of course nerve-wracking for many involved, to try and shift that power somewhat more into the region and embed it within the Pacific Island region. I wanted to talk a little bit about the design process and have Dorkly put up photos of the design team, because in the Pacific, as in everywhere, those who are involved in the process of creating and imagining and visioning this new program are important to how it will be perceived, to how it will be embedded, to how it will be taken up by others going forward. So you can see the diversity and the different range of voices in the design team. From the left, we've got Yoshiko from the advisory board, the Pacific Women's own kind of governance and guiding board, which is provides high-level strategic advice. So she comes from the North Pacific, traditionally quite underrepresented in our development efforts that originate from Australian aid. And she also is connected to feminist movements and young women's movements. Then we've got Savina, who's from the Solomon Islands and is active in disability inclusion movements. And has been really important to have her as part of that design. We've got Corinne from DFAT, Miles, who's Fijian, from the Pacific community or the SPC, who's going to play a really big role in the new program going forward. We had Michael Pilbara, who brings his wonderful approach as the facilitating consultant for the design, and then I'm in there as well. But it was interesting to be able to wear two hats, to be on the design team as well as implementing the current support unit. And I think that's because, recognizing that particularly in our small island state region, people are wearing multiple hats and can do so in quite fluid ways. And that, the strength of relationships that people bring into a design process like this is really important for how it gets taken up. It's far from a perfect process, that's for sure, because has been carried out in a COVID context. Nobody could come together face to face and hash things out. but there was a strong attempt to get a lot of feedback, and people sharing concerns, including from within the Pacific, about the form of this localization project. The idea of localizing it through a regional intergovernmental organization like the Pacific Community carried its own risks for many people, given how conservatively some Pacific governments have acted towards progressing gender equality, despite really strong commitments in this area. So there was all of that to be taken on board. So where did we land? Quite quickly, it was, within a couple of months, rather than a full comprehensive decided design, there was a design framework or an overarching framework that was developed that really just stated an overarching goal and objectives, and a bit of thought on how it would be implemented. So what does it look like if we want to devolve more Pacific leadership, if we want to have it be more Pacific-led? One of that was where and how it was announced. So the Foreign Minister of Australia announced it at the Triennial Conference of Pacific Women, which happens every 3 years, and is convened by SPC, the Pacific Community. So she announced the commitment, the length of time, and the focus areas of the new program. That was in April. The goal is something that the design team, we've been quite happy with, because it included this idea of diversity, which is really key in a region that goes from the drought-stricken, northern atolls to the extremely linguistically diverse, largeness of PNG. So, with that kind of diversity, the idea of gender diversity, the idea of diverse experiences was really important. And this idea of equitably sharing in resources being what we wanted to see happen. That was really shaped by the consultations, which is, I guess, another aspect of this idea of localization. The final outcomes were also strongly influenced actually by the voices of the Pacific stakeholders that we spoke to, as well as, the Pacific Islanders within the team. So this idea that women's economic empowerment as part of a women's rights agenda remaining really important. The idea of Pacific feminist civil society being explicitly mentioned, their role, that came through very strongly from some of the stakeholders involved. I won't dwell too much on the detail of this, but really happy to answer any questions if you do have it. Just to say that this was, while there are realities of the Partnerships for Recovery framework set by Australia and, DFAT's own kind of strategic interest, there was within that still room to co-create something, some outcomes that are important to the Pacific and to those who are working for gender equality in the region. So the proposed management model, in order to put this idea of localization and Pacific-led development in practice, the model looks a bit different to what we're used to. So, the comfort space and the space which really has been really quite successful has been the partnership with the managing contractor to then deliver and manage partnerships and provide that technical advice, as was done under Pacific Women. But in order to embed and try and devolve some of that power from where it currently sits within Canberra to ensure that Pacific countries are also able to lead aspects of this work, the SPC, the Pacific Community, which covers 22 Pacific Island countries, is going to be one of the main implementers of this work. And so as part of this, and I'll come to that in a moment, myself and members of my current team will be moving across to create continuity in relationships in the work, and to help embed this work more firmly within the region. So SPC has a very big role. There's also a portion that will be led by civil society, and Michelle and her colleagues and other feminist funds are heavily involved in that area of work. But it will be sort of separately governed, but connected to the rest of Pacific Women Lead. DFAT will continue to, of course, have its direct UN partnerships and some of those other large partners that they'll manage directly. And there will also be a role for what they're terming an enabling contractor. If your question is, what is an enabling contractor? That's an excellent question. I think the idea being conveyed is that it is smaller in scope than what currently Cardno provides for this program, and will be focused on managing the challenging job of the monitoring and evaluation across the entirety of the program, as well as managing discrete pieces such as the balance of power program, which will go forward. It's quite interesting to have a look then at how this transition is being planned without going too far down the transition planning rabbit hole, but just to say that this idea of Pacific ownership is up there because that's really being stated up front as an important aspect of this change that's being proposed, along with the usual expectations around effectiveness and value for money. We also, each partner was consulted, so partners were able to influence how they would be managed going forward for those partnerships that would continue. When you're working on gender equality in the Pacific region, there are a core set of partners that you will continue to work with, whatever the iteration, because they are kind of critical to the achievement of some of these outcomes. So it's important that they are brought along with this change in a way that works well for them. So the partner's preference and the way that the management, whatever the management modality is, their capacity to provide appropriate support, all of these were also taken into account. And I think the other thing that's been really important is the overarching approach set by the Pacific Women Advisory Board and the co-chair of that board, Virsilimbu Ndromo, around moving with gratitude and respect. So really taking a Pacific approach to this localization project, a Pacific approach to this change, where it's not always about the new and shiny thing, but respect for the decades of work that have brought us to this point, and, together moving on a journey that takes us to the next one. So here is an attempt at mapping out what the transition looks like in action. It relies on a really solid relationship between SPC, the Cardno Managed Support Unit, and the DFAT counterparts. And again, as I started to write this out, I realized I could go down a pathway of talking to you far too much about the transition that we're currently engaged in, and less perhaps about the principles of localization behind it. But I guess the way that we do each of these pieces relates to then this project of localization. To the left, the details of that head grant agreement, the way that DFAT and SPC will make decisions is really critical to the idea of this transfer of power. To what extent is SPC, as a regional intergovernmental organization led by Pacific governments, going to be able to make decisions about how resourcing is spent, about what work gets taken forward, about what partnerships get taken forward? And the details of that is really going to underpin this localization approach. The governance, one of the aspects of the new design is to shift from perhaps you could unkindly say a rubber stamping governance board approach to a board that really does have a role in governing and even directing or deciding on some of the resourcing within the program. And to do that, they're looking at kind of cordoning off a portion of a budget that the governance board could have direct control over, as well as providing strategic advice to other parts of the program. SPC, of course, is very much part of the Pacific and is also then experiencing the same challenges with gender equality and promotion of women's leadership as you will find in other civil service type environments. And so another thing that they are looking to address jointly is this idea of pathways for women's leadership, even within the organization itself, to model that outwards, to ensure that gender mainstreaming project they're undertaking across their whole of institution, will go forward. And I think that's also quite an exciting opportunity. For the support unit, for us, it's the nitty-gritty of each and every partnership and of the transition of up to 16 of our people across to SPC. So I'm excited to be part of that move, and along with my colleagues, forming a little bit of a thuggish gender gang that will be joining SPC's Human Rights and Social Development Division. And I guess that brings me to my final slide that I wanted to take just a couple more minutes with, about what does localization look like. And I keep showing you photos of people, but for me, they're not moving pieces on a board, but each, if we're thinking about relationships, most of these people, everyone you see here already has prior connections to SPC, to DFAT. Some of them have worked for DFAT before, some of them have worked for SPC before, or civil society. And we're all part of this very complex interplay of relationships and connections that are not incidental to the job, but are an intrinsic part of it. Now, all these people currently work on the program. The face of the development doesn't change. Pacific Women kind of has a mandate to have a Pacific Islander leading it or co-leading it. That's already built in, and Cardno has really done, I think, an excellent job in identifying, attracting, and promoting kind of somewhere where Pacific expertise is valued. So what is different? What is this localization project? And it really is, it brings into sharp relief the idea that it is about that transfer of power. It's about who's making the big decisions, because we'll continue to make the day-to-day decisions as we have been doing, but who's going to make some of those big resourcing decisions, the big partnership decisions, setting the direction. And I think that's where localization really matters. That's where it's most challenging. And so, I think it comes back to relationships again, and being able to move with trust, having our DFAT counterparts having that relationship of trust with us, that they are willing to try and find ways to make this different setup, this very different and potentially risky setup, work. I feel like I've babbled on a bit long, so I will draw it to a close there. There were a couple of other aspects that I had wanted to mention, which are things that structurally provide us the strength to make this transition. One of them is a co-leadership model that we have at the support unit, where myself and someone based in Australia together lead the work of the support unit. And there are some other aspects, but I feel like I have talked too long. So I will stop now and give it back to Mark and to Michelle. Binaka.
Thanks very much, Tara. That was great. Before we hand over to Michelle, I'd just like to give the floor opportunity to ask any questions you might have specifically around Tara's presentation or Pacific Women or the transition to Pacific Women's Lead. There must be some questions. Just one from me, Tara. I guess I noticed that the DFAT is part of that design team. So obviously they're integrally involved in the discussions and where it's heading. How this kind of shift of power that you're talking about with a really large investment, $170 million, so I guess beyond Corinne, how comfortable are they with it? And do you have any insights into some of the trepidation that might be thinking about all of this?
Yeah. There's definitely nerves there, and understandably so. It's a risk. And how do you mitigate that? And and I think one of the useful solutions has been to have the MEL portion be with the enabling contractor, because that means, feeding the beast or responding to those information requests can be done in a manner to which DFAT is used to, leaving this, portion perhaps freer to continue to do the implementation. So, I mean, that's one way I see it. There is nervousness, and I think, they've made a big commitment through the design to some of this devolution that's going to be challenging. It's not going to be simple or easy or necessarily go smoothly over the first year or two. But let's see. I think it's a good attempt being made here.
Yeah. Okay. The other question I had was around, I guess, the transition of some responsibilities that would probably currently sit with Cardno to SPC. I mean, I think Michelle will speak to how that has occurred on Fiji Women's Fund, and it's a direct relationship between Cardno and the fund. And so there's, you can have that sort of phased transfer over a period of time. But is there any direct kind of interaction going on and transfer of that responsibility, or is it just going to be one day Cardno stops doing it and the next day SPC picks it up?
No, I mean, there's such detailed conversations. So it's mostly mediated through us, the staff of the support unit, and then we, throw it back to kind of, Cardno in Canberra and Melbourne. But it is very much like there are Cardno to SPC discussions around novation of contracts and, other fun things like notes of substitution, which I'm learning all about, things like that. And, agreement around when personnel contracts ended with one and start with another. So there's been a lot of that. And we got some feedback from DFAT, because I have never been involved in a process like this before, but they were, I guess, it felt like an kind of air of pleasant surprise that it was, we were able to talk and do this kind of thing, but it made sense. And I think the thing is, many of us know each other already, and it's a little easier to start those conversations and to keep them going. And because our core team is moving across, there's this sort of bridge that exists there that also makes these conversations perhaps a little easier. Yeah.
Okay. The only other question was, do your colleagues know that you call them the thuggish gender gang?
No, maybe a little different.
Joe, got a question.
Hey Tara, thanks for a great presentation. I was just wondering, what's been the reaction that you've heard of about this concept of a big DFAT program moving into a sustainable model in the region with full regional ownership and leadership? What reaction have you heard about this, both from sort of people outside the program as well as people within the program?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm always scared when Joe asks a question. It's always going to be a good one. But I think it's a mixed bag, which is to me good, because when Pacific Women started it's a great initiative. It's supporting Pacific priorities, but just the way it entered made people feel like the agenda was set by Australia and they didn't have a say in it. So the fact that there's actually a mixed reaction as we go in and before we've even got started is really helpful. So I think there is concern by some who, like particularly those who work in a more activist, advocate, feminist space, around the idea of an intergovernmental organization leading it, given how conservative some of our governments have been around gender equality. But there's also for the idea of devolving to like Pacific leadership, there seems to be quite widespread support for that idea. Within DFAT, I think there's a lot of questions being raised, like how exactly will the governance work? How will the different pieces fit together? How will we get the information we need? Some of those questions have been coming up, and you would be hearing about them more directly from where you sit. But yeah, I think there's generally support for the initiative, but there's all sorts of competing interests at play as soon as you get to something of this size. Like there'll be competing interests around why this particular division within SPC gets to kind of do this work and this budget, why here and not there. So all these things will come into play, and the first year is going to be really important for for kind of saying this was a good idea after all. No pressure.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, if there's no other questions right now, we might move on to Michelle's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so just give me a second to put up my slide. Just checking, are you able to see that?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, everyone. Bula, thank you, Tara, for watering the ground for me. It's a really nice segue for the Women's Fund Fiji to talk a little bit about our experience in terms of localizing. So one of the key things I wanted to touch on first was to talk about what a women's fund is. And just to really set the I guess the understanding of what a women's fund is and why does it matter. So women's funds are key agents of change. Really, we are the resource mobilizers of the feminist and women's movement in Fiji. And women's funds have always been around. One of the oldest women's fund is called Mama Cash. They started in 1983 by Dutch feminists and activists. And there's a core group of women's funds. There are around 40 women's funds who work in 37 countries that belong to a network, which is called Prospera International Network of Women's Fund. And the Women's Fund Fiji is really the only national women's fund in the Pacific. So kudos to DFAT and to Cardno, and also the feminists and activists in Fiji for really setting the scene and the tone for a women's fund that's fully a national women's fund, but also looking at creating a new fund for the Pacific. Part of the work that we do as resource mobilizers is to ensure that the voices and ideas of women, girls, and trans people are at the forefront of social change. So we're really guided by their experiences and their knowledge of what works for them. And our role is really to find both financial and non-financial resources to support that work. In terms of our origins, so just to give you a snapshot of what was part of the ingredients. Fiji is really well known across the Pacific for having one of the most diverse, but also the most vibrant women's movement. And part of that as well is the feminist and rights women's organizations in Fiji have always engaged with women's funds such as Mama Cash, a global fund for women. And so it was that experience of looking at how you can shift aid and philanthropy by women's funds that really cemented the idea for Fiji. So in 2015, DFAT had commissioned a civil society analysis that included women's funds. And one of the recommendations from the 2015 civil society analysis was for DFAT to investigate the feasibility of establishing a locally managed women's fund. And part of that then led to a formal announcement also in the same year of 2015. And DFAT hired a 3-member team to design the Fiji Women's Fund. And the design really talked a lot about the localizing of the Women's Fund. It made suggestions, but it didn't have like a game plan of what localization was going to be. In fact, the dreaming and the shaping of the localization strategy and the handover plan was really one that was done in partnership with Cardno. So we have contracting representatives in the room. Lois was one of our contracting representatives. Simone, I believe, is also in the room, and Joe and Mai. We worked quite closely on shaping that together. So after the design occurred in 2015 with the localization idea within that design, DFAT really put out an open call looking for representatives to become part of the steering committee. And so the steering committee of the Women's Fund was made up of 9 women. And within that steering committee, DFAT had a seat in it. They then also began hiring new roles. So the role of the fund manager and the finance and admin officer were the first two roles that were advertised and hired in 2017. And so I've been with the fund since then. What has really changed? Sorry, let me just go back. So it's been interesting in the sense of localization and what that means for Fiji Women's Fund, or now the Women's Fund Fiji. Because it's always been part of the design, there was an intentional interest and value that was placed by Cardno, as well as DFAT in terms of how we would work together. So in terms of decision making, visibility, content creation, working with partners, all of that was a space that was, I would say, contested, also negotiated, and I think in a way came to a really great space where the Fiji Women's Fund was able to really establish its own identity and its own legitimacy as a women's fund, and really articulating from the beginning this idea that we would eventually become a registered being. And so the ways of working between DFAT, Cardno, the fund team, even with the partners from the women's movement in Fiji and the Pacific, and with women's funds, it's been a delicate dance. Yeah, and it's been a really interesting dance, I must say. We've had different dance moves come into play. So what has changed now that we are registered as the Women's Fund Fiji? Well, a lot of things has changed. Our governance, for instance, has changed dramatically. So we started off with a steering committee that then shifted into a transitional steering committee that really paved the way in terms of what needed to be done under the localization strategy, to now having a board of trustees, a governance board, and a grants committee that's fully made up of Fijian citizens, and that come from a diverse background. So you have people from private sector, feminists and activists from the women's movement, you have people from academia, and just a really nice bunch of skills and knowledge within both the board of trustees and the governance board and the grants committee. Our identity has changed in the sense that the name of the fund has changed a lot. Alongside with that, we also spent a lot of time as a team really articulating our vision and our mission and our values, something that we had thought of for a long time, but it was never formally written down. So now, and you'll see in our latest blog, that we really are very proud to share what those values and a mission and vision. Of course, the operational processes and mechanisms. So there were a couple of things that Cardno was doing with the fund, providing some support, to now moving towards creation of new processes and policies that again has to be endorsed by our new governance board. So the decision making has also changed dramatically. The other thing that's really changed with the development of our 3-year strategic plan is that there's clarity for the Women's Fund Fiji in terms of where we're going and what we want to achieve in the next 3 years, and using that strategic plan to really guide the work that we plan to do. I wanted to share some of the triumphs and joy of the transition. Like I said earlier on, building our profile and credibility from the beginning was really important. And Tara talked about ownership. And I think ownership in any region is really important when you moving into a new area, or when you're creating something. This idea of co-creation and ownership is really important. And we spent a really good 2 years doing that with our partners, talking about what the fund is, openly also talking about what were the challenges, and then looking at ways to then address those challenges. I think being transparent and accountable really helped, and being a really good listener also helped. We're really proud of being a registered entity. Very, very proud. Even the governance board, I think that's a really, I'm getting more teary, but it's such an amazing experience to get the legal status, and then get all these amazing people be part of the structure. I think the other thing that Cardno and DFED alongside with the fund can be really proud of is the contribution that we've made in strengthening the women's and feminist movement in Fiji. And I say this because with the civil sector analysis that DFED had done in 2015, one of the key things that came out was there was definitely a challenge in terms of resources being distributed to rural and remote women's groups. And the idea and the problem with that was there was a lot of great work that was happening in rural and remote areas around gender equality. They just did not have the resources. And so we've seen since our birth in 2017 how diverse that movement can be, and introducing new players into the space is really important. It's really great for creativity, and it's really great for collaboration. I think the other thing that we are really proud of is our contribution to establishing the Pacific Feminist Fund, which is going to be the first regional fund in the Pacific. And Tara talked about how that sits within the Pacific LEAD program as a whole. So really super happy about that. I think with Cardno, as I said, it's been a really interesting journey. I think what's really worked well, and you would have read that in Joe and Mai's blog around this idea of co-shared responsibility. So, celebrate all the great stuff, but at the same time, you are dealing with the challenges together. So it's not the one party that has to face the head teacher. It's the two of you trying to figure out, well, what can we do now that we know this challenge? And relationships really matter. It really, really matters how you communicate with people, how you maintain those relationships that can often, and in our space, turn into really fruitful friendships. So relationships and communication really matter in localization. And of course, there's always anxiety, and anxiety can bring out the worst, and it has. I won't lie about that, but it's also brought out the best in us. One thing that the pandemic has contributed to the localization is, falling forward in terms of finding clarity between Cardno and the fund on, who does what and when, and who gets to decide, and where the decisions being made. And really being clear about that. So meeting every month to talk about, well, what's happening in the finance area, what's happening in the governance area, and sharing that is really important. I also talked about the power of friendships and relationships earlier, and they really are important because you can be on 100% battery today and tomorrow you're really low, but talking about that really openly within your team, but also with a contracting representative that's really important, because they can get and understand where you're at, but also creatively find solutions towards that. It's really important to manage transitions and expectations. Like for us, we learned earlier on when we were putting our trust deed together that it's a lot of work. There's so many moving parts, and you can't be the sole person looking after all of that. So hiring somebody with that skills and knowledge to be able to help you manage those transitions, whether it's the human resources or whether it's in grants or other areas. There's also the importance of institutional memory. With any transition, you have people who are either going to remain or processes that are going to change, or people leaving. It's really important to document that. And so one of the things that we'll be releasing later this year, so follow us on our social media platforms, is this open and honest experience of what were the changes that we went through, and what did we learn from those changes? What were the best practices? And if we were to share our mana with you, these would be some of those pearls of wisdom. And the last one is like, you know what you know, and you plan for what you don't know. And when things change, and trust me, things have changed for many, many, many times, you respond creatively and adaptively. So where to from here? Well, there's a lot of things happening from here. We are going to be going through a comprehensive due diligence, which really then allows us to receive funding directly from DFAT. The comprehensive due diligence from our perspective as a team is really an opportunity to see, what are some things that we have in place and what are some opportunities that we can really strengthen internally so that we, I would say, are more resilient towards working with multiple donors or funders. It also means a new way of working. So earlier on, I said that DFAT was sitting on the governance, on the steering committee and on the grants committee. They no longer sit in that space. And that also, in a way, means that there's some level of power that's shifted. So looking at ways in terms of keeping them up to date, but also being really clear that some of the decisions that are made by the fund's own governance structure is one that is paramount. And so really looking at, again, going into a new dense item with different partners. Of course, like I said, the handover from Cardno, so technically all our contracts end on the 31st of December. There's all these other pieces that we're working with Cardno on. And like I said, implementing our 3-year strategic plan. In a way, it's exciting because it's almost like, you're kind of starting afresh as well. It's some things you'll be doing that you've known for the last 4 years, but in a lot of ways, it's also moving into a new space. So, yeah. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Naka.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. I don't know if you've seen, but there's a lot of congratulations in the comments for you and the program and all the people involved for the recent registration. It really is a wonderful achievement. So yeah, well done to you. Also enjoyed all of your references to dancing. It sounds like a fun project to work on. Won't ask you to demonstrate. So throw it open. Are there questions for Michelle? Must be. Just a question, or perhaps not even for Michelle necessarily, but I mean, you're talking about your delicate dance moves and that kind of co-shared responsibility with Cardno. Just interested if any of the Cardno staff responsible, Mai and Joe and others. I know you touched on this in your blog, but just I guess your experience around that sort of co-partnership and what it's meant for you and your roles and how it's challenged you and having to do things differently on the program. Can I put anyone on the spot?
I can go first. I think even this morning, Michelle and I had a laugh about our roles, and we had an important meeting yesterday with DFAT, and I messaged her prior to the meeting. I said, should I be in this? Should it just be you and DFAT communicating with each other? It's now moving to the next phase. And then she said, no, you have to be there. And I'm glad I was there, but it's challenging because we still hold the obligations to DFAT. We're still managing the personnel, the HR, the finances. So it is like hand holding up to a certain point. But there's a lot of confidence, I think, within the team. And Michelle and I have learned a lot over the last 6 to 12 months of how we operate, how we work, what our strengths are and what our weaknesses have been. And just having that nurturing and very supportive relationship. Yeah, I know I'm getting emotional too. But it has been a triumph working with the team, and they're very collaborative. They're very open to suggestions, and I have felt very comfortable with working with the team because when I haven't been able to address an issue or a problem, it's an easy forum to admit that, to be honest. And then I think that helps managing expectations and working together in the future.
Thanks, Mai. Joe, did you want to add anything or?
Sure. I guess as you can see, it's an emotional journey for everybody. I think it makes it really different when, as we sort of say in the blog, this sustainability and localization is actually baked into the design of what you're doing, the intention of what you're doing right from the beginning, which means that, you know, from a pure managing contractor commercial point of view, that's your deliverable. That's what you're held responsible for and accountable for. So it doesn't make it just about, you know, doing the right thing or reaching for development effectiveness. It's actually that's what everyone's here to make sure happens by the end of a contract period. So I think that makes a real difference, and in that sort of hard commercial sense for a contractor. But I think for the team involved, it does also make it a really different partnership and a different kind of journey. And as everyone's talked about, everything obviously is about that relationship and about, I think both Tara and Michelle have reflected that localization is really about power, and it's really about where power sits and how power, the balance of is expressed by different partners and seen and understood and, you know, is held in different ways. So I think it is a way of really setting a different kind of power balance between the different partners involved in a development relationship. So I think that's why it is such a unique story. Yeah, it's I think it just means we couldn't be prouder that we've got to this stage of where we've got to.
Thank you. I've got a question from Lois Knight. Lois, there's a lot of people on this call who are very happy to see your name and face pop up.
Hey, I'm happy to be here too. Yeah, hi. And Michelle, I'm joining the emotional ranks here today, actually, and have been watching this from afar, of course. I wondered if you could comment, Michelle, on the intersection of the feminist ways of working and what I consider to be the best example of partnership work I know of, certainly anything I've been part of, and why that's different. Because I think whilst there aren't many funds likely to be launched around the world, or certainly none other that I know of at the moment, the way of working that your group has led the way in is a lot of those lessons are applicable to other program areas.
Yeah, great question, Lois. I think when you come into a space as a feminist, you are always looking at power, right? Because patriarchy is about power. It's how you want to break patriarchy down. And in the aid and development and philanthropy sector, there is a lot of power. Like who has the money gets to decide where that money goes, and they get to tell you what they want. So it's about like, but also who's in power is made up of people. So, you know, when we say DFAT is an institution that's made up of people, and those people drive that institution. So for me, I think what's always been interesting is understanding people who are part of DFAT. So whoever the DFAT person I'm with and engaging with, I'm always curious to find out what are their interests that's not work related. So you move into the space really looking at that, building a relationship that's not transactional at all. I mean, you will eventually talk about money later on. So every time I go into a room asking for money, I don't ask for money first. You're trying to nurture that relationship, and then you're also trying to figure out like what drives them and what's the anxiety level, and then you bring in what you think you can contribute towards, but being also really clear about what can shift and what can't shift. I think what's different about feminist movement building or the approach of feminists is being really clear that those who are closest to the problem are the best people to find the solution. So, when we get proposals and applications, of course, we have our own ideas of, yeah, they should do it this way. You know, why didn't they think of it? So these are the way that you even communicate that to potential grantee partners is important. So you're not saying you should do this. You're saying, you know, we've been thinking this is an offering. Would you be interested? And this is how we can support you. And whether they choose to or not, it's their decision at the end of the day. So it's really everything in terms of how you communicate, how you engage. Everything is about power, really. And taking that as the lens to analyzing any situation. And Maya and I have had interesting conversations, you know, where we've prepared as Cardno and the fund to go into a conversation with DFAT and spending time on being clear about, okay, well, these are the questions we need to know, ask, and also getting DFAT to respond, because sometimes I find that when we go into a room, we are expected to know all the answers. Actually, we may not know all the answers, but we can share what we certainly know and then ask for opinions. And that really shifts, I think, the complexity of the conversation. When you can say, well, this is what we know, and this is plan A and plan B. What do you think? And engage them in that way. I think what would be interesting now that the Women's Fund Fiji is registered and we don't have, and actually that was one of the core findings that came out of the trust deed, is that our partners, both from Fiji and the women's funds across the world, there's no funder that sits on their governance board. There's no funder that sits on their grant selection. And that is about dissolving the power. And so really communicating that and also finding alternatives is something that we'll be doing from 2022. I mean, we're already thinking about creative ways, but speaking openly about it and finding ways to do that is going to be interesting, yeah. Sorry, I rambled on, Lois.
Thanks, Lo. Other questions? I had another question, perhaps both for Michelle and Tara. Joe and I had an interesting conversation with Balance of Power this morning, and Mariani and Wilson, feel free to jump in on this if you want to. But they just talked about, you know, some of the challenges around meeting reporting and accountability requirements and capturing sophisticated communications products for, you know, a highly localized program with you know, leadership staff using English as a second language and the level of comfort with that. I guess, you know, that's a common challenge, I think, and I guess I wonder how you've both managed that situation, how you've met those expectations. Have you managed to change those expectations at all? Yeah, what's your experience been?
Would you like to go first on this one, Mish?
I knew you would put me on the spot.
you deserve that.
Turn. Yeah, we've had, when we first started off, we didn't actually have a communications budget line. There was no communications budget line. And I think earlier on, we made the case that if we were to transition, we needed to use all forms of platforms to lift the profile, right? Like, it's called profiling and branding. And we made the case to DFAT that we should have some communications budget. And over time, that budget has actually become larger. At certain times, it becomes smaller, and then we think of creative ways, like, you know, getting a sister fund to donate skills for free for something, or getting money from somebody else. I think for us, and Erica's in the room today, Erica's our communications officer, we've been really great at learning earlier on that everybody's a communicator and everybody's a resource mobilizer in your team. But you only know that if you know that internally. But for us to be able to generate interest, profile, legitimacy, we needed to have a public image, right? And so you'll notice over time, Our social platforms have been really particular and strategic about what we are writing about. So like, for instance, now from August, we're already beginning to communicate what the change is, what to expect, who are the new board of trustees, where are we going in the next 3 years. I think that communication is really important. I know from experience, and Erica can talk, can share, is that there are really great communicators in your team. You know, some are not really great writers, but they're not great writers. They think they're not great writers because they haven't explored that. But if you build a really great nurturing environment where they can co-write with somebody else, voila, you'll have somebody that will write the second, the third, the fourth blog. So, you know, we've had team members do that. And there's some people who don't like to write, but like to narrate stories. So, you know, it's really looking at what you currently have and using it to the maximum that you can. I'm not even saying that correctly, but I think you get my drift. The reporting one is an interesting thing because I think for the fund, as we get more funders on board, there will be different expectations as to the level of reporting and what type of data is needed. I know from experience and learning from the sister funds that have been around forever, is that, you know, it's a place where you can negotiate a template that can be shared across 2 or 3 bilaterals. They've done it in the past. So we don't get to write 5 different reports. We write the one report and then we pull out certain parts that really matter to, say, the Dutch or really matter to the Australians. I think it's also about negotiating. I mean, earlier on we had to report every 6 months, and then annually we negotiated it to just annually. It made no sense to report at 6 months when, you know, you don't have a fully baked cake. It makes sense to report a year, and we'll tell you a little bit more than what we would have told you at the 6 months. So I think it's a process. I think for us it's also trial and error. I mean, we've been also using some really great apps, like Impact Mapper is one that we've been using in the past, and now also discovering more of its applicability for some really nice, sharp case studies and other things. Yeah, over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Mish. I really appreciated those reflections. Yeah, I think comms is a funny area because your comms will be approved by people who are not comms people. So when you're working on a program like this, your communications products, your reporting, they're not being approved by comms people. It will be your direct manager there. So for communications products, which are separate, you know, that outward facing stuff, that's really challenging around both helping your DFAT counterparts along on the journey around comms. You know, this is why we do this is effective. And a lot of that is about the relationship of trust, or the relationship that exists between you at that time. If it's not a good one, then what's going to happen, and what we've experienced, is the diving in deep on grammar and full stops and bullet points and where they're placed and how things are arranged. And it's a horrific experience for everyone. I think not least for the person who's diving in deep and looking for full stops and commas. I think it's, but I think it's probably a symptom of the relationship you have, and sure, some people's predilections, but I think it's that. And, you know, it's lovely to have Lois here because it's easy to forget that time that we used to have in the program, and we're in a very different place now with a greater level of trust, or certain things having shifted, or maybe, you know, just a general people who can't remember what that time was like anymore. We're in a place where we can talk about an approach, get an agreement on an approach, and move forward with that. And I don't know if that's luck of the draw or just, you know, trust building over time. I still don't really know for sure. With the reporting side of it, yeah, certainly I think it's the trust building over time to lessen the reporting burden, because we were producing an annual operations report of 20-30 pages, 6 monthly activity analysis that involved the entire team, which were also 20-30 pages, and then an outward facing annual progress report that broke not one but two people who just would leave before they had to do another one. in the support unit. They were really intense processes. And I think, yeah, that's also come a long way, where we've, just as we exit, that burden has been lessened. For me personally, my background is in comms. I'm a comms person, and we're surrounded in the support unit by strong communicators of all types, both a really strong comms team, there's 3 of them, as well as, you know, people with that real Pacific flair for communications. You know, they can grab a room and they can hold its attention and they can convey what they got to convey. The order in which the words are used and the grammatical syntax, whatever, is not really important in that context. You know, they got charisma. They can bring that conversation about gender equality into a room and manage it really well. So, you know, I think we're in a sweet spot as far as that communications element is concerned. But it's not a one-off. It'll be an ongoing negotiation as we start to deal with new people. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good one, Tara, because you reminded me of what it was like as well with the comms. Like, everything had to be approved for whatever reason and rationale, to now where, you know, there are only certain things that we go to DFAT for, and all the other things are like up to us. We can decide on, we want to go with this kind of illustration or this kind of layout, but it's over time that has changed. And I know it was also because localization was baked into the design. So we talked about, you know, there's a way of working, communicating that feminist women's funds do, and this is not one of those ways. Sure, if, you know, it's a risk and you want to have a look at this document, yeah, you will look at this document. There's also an interesting experience that we had when we partnered with another women's fund. So the document that we were producing is not just the Women's Fund Fiji document. It's a document that comes out of a partnership. So any feedback that comes from one funder, it has to be dealt with 2 partners, right? It's not just me dealing with it. So, and bringing that up to different people to say, well, you know, if there's an issue, please address it with both the fund and the other partner. It's interesting also when the Fiji Women's Fund is part of a consortium. So we are the part of the consortium that's going to be part of the Pacific Women Lead, that the feminist funds one. The way that the discussion occurs there is very different. There is power that's very different from power that I have in a room as the sole women's fund and only funded by one bilateral, as opposed to being part of a consortium and the power that you bring to that conversation. So, you know, conversations around communications and reporting was very different, which I thoroughly enjoyed and learned a lot of skills, and looking forward to using that as well.
Thank you. Joe, you're not going to ask your question? Did your arm get tired having your hand up for so long?
No, there's a question in the chat. I thought.
Okay, yeah. Did you see that, Michelle, just from Mafuizo, about who will be leading the due diligence process and how will that be used in the transition trajectory and handover from Cardno? Briefly.
Yep. So the due diligence, obviously, DFAT is the one that's contracting out KPMG. So KPMG is the one that's doing the due diligence. It so happens that KPMG is also doing a due diligence for another organization called the Fiji Women's Crisis Center. So it's good timing, because what they're learning from that work is also going to apply in the methodology that they use with the Women's Fund Fiji. We had a role to play in the terms of reference. We played a role in terms of the timelines and now looking at methodology. We did not have a role to play at all in the hiring, and I don't think we'll have we might, in the hiring. So that's all taken care by DFAT, and I believe Cardno is the managing contractor that's looking after that piece of work. One key thing that's going to come out, of course, is the report from the due diligence, but we kind of planned it in a way that the due diligence is happening at a time when we are developing a 3-year design, because we want the due diligence findings to be incorporated with that 3-year design, and especially like if there are high risk areas, and we want to use the first year focusing on internal mechanisms, strengthening that, and then other areas. Hope that answers.
Thanks, Michelle. Are there any last questions from anyone for Michelle or Tara? Maybe, sorry, just one more from me, Tara. Just, you mentioned the co-leadership model briefly just before you finished up your presentation. I mean, are you able to just give a very brief overview of how it works and how you've divided responsibilities and why?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So we went through a period of change at the support unit where our team leader finished up, and then they, I got the opportunity, I guess, to move into a co-leadership role. And in discussing the shift and the change and how we do it, and Joe, of course, being a huge part of that, we opted for the co-leadership model. And it's based on the feminist co-leadership model that we've seen at play in other places, such as particularly in the Women's Fund space, but also in other spaces. And it provides kind of a bit of strength, resilience through periods of change. As well as for us, it felt like a much more genuine illustration of what we're trying to achieve through Pacific Women. Really was essentially an Australia and Pacific partnership. And it did feel a little tokenistic, I guess, to me personally, to put a Pacific Islander as the cherry on the top when there was, that leadership really was effectively shared with a counterpart who was Australian and worked from Australia. And it felt like such a much more genuine arrangement for achieving what we were trying to achieve, for illustrating the ways that genuinely Australia and the Pacific could work together. It was a little microcosm of that. And then through the change process, like it really came into its own because we put that model into place. And thanks, Michelle, for popping that in the chat box. So we put this arrangement in place, and then right after that, COVID hit. And then Pacific Women went through an accelerated process of change. And, like a third of our team had to be pulled out of Fiji and go back to Australia, South Africa, Canada. And so it provided us with a lot of resilience through that change, because you'd have Leonie, who was my co-lead at that time, working from Canberra. It was perfect. She had great access to Joe and Angela Len, and of course our DFAT counterparts. And I was here in Suva with the team and providing, I guess, that stability and support as we went through that change. And we also, the pandemic affected the different places at different moments in time. So it meant that we always had someone who was a little, would be able to maybe take on a few more things while the other half of the team was being more affected, and vice versa. And as we went into the design of the new program and started moving towards localization, it meant we could really discreetly divvy up a set of responsibilities. It meant that I could be part of the design team, because I could take off that support unit explicit hat and just be a part of that design team in that moment. And Leonie would continue on with those core functions of the support unit. So we could have that sort of separation that made everyone more comfortable. So that was a really great part of it. And then feeding it back in, obviously. I can't now think of a better way of working, and I'm really sorry to. I don't think that the SPC structure has that explicitly within it. It's certainly something that we'll be bringing across and advocating for, because it's worked so well that I just can't think of another way of working that can beat the co-leadership model, as long as you kind of have some shared values, some complementary approaches, and that, I found it really good. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe?
I wanted to ask a tough question because Tara's dared me. So I guess in talking about this concept of localization, and it's a fraught term, and it's it's an area that's really complex and political. And I'm interested in, firstly, your own personal experiences, Tara and Michelle, as people, human beings from the Pacific, from Fiji, leading an Australian government-funded initiative, which is soon to become, more localised and grounded in the region in different ways. What are some of your own perspectives, the kinds of personal kind of challenges that it brings to you as someone who sort of lives and breathes in the community that you're working in, but has all the politics to manage of essentially foreign governments, foreign companies, other actors that are coming in and that you have to engage with? What does that mean for you as a person?
In 5 minutes or less.
In 5 minutes or less. Okay, Michelle, I'll dive in if you like, or would you like to go first?
Yeah, no, you go. Well, actually, I can go. I vividly remember a couple of days when I was working at the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and Tara was part of those early on days, and we used to be in an old wooden building. And we were recipients of grants. And as a recipient of a grant from whoever the funder was, there was always this politics of, they're asking this question, they ask us at this time, they tell us we have to give an answer in 1 hour. There's all these reporting. So there is both that personal and professional experience of being a grant recipient and having to deal with, funders or even development people play different roles in the development sector. So you've kind of been part of it, right? So what are the joys of working in it, but you also know firsthand what can really piss you off. And so what pisses me off is things that I keep in mind every time we go out and do something, like when we hire somebody that's going to do a piece of work for us. Like, how do we introduce this person who may not be a Pacific Islander? Is this person a really good fit? What are values? And asking some of those questions during the recruitment. So I think personally, being part of the movement and experiencing some of those really uncomfortable things also really drove me to this job. Like, I love this. I love being able to set up the first women's fund and changing even the way that we grant and the processes, so that we're always asking, how are we making decisions? Is it just made by all the 5 women sitting in Suva, or is it coming also, are people from the community that you are saying you're part of making those decisions with you? I think that that personal is political. It's so true. Being part of the movement really has helped, I think, for me, navigate those difficult, and I don't think it's gonna go away. I mean, life would be boring if there was no challenges and nothing that really kept you up at night, which is not also a great thing. But it also brings out, like I said, the anxiety does in many ways brings out the best of you and the best of the situation. Yeah, over and out. Over to you, Tario.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for evoking that old wooden building that we haunted. Michelle and I worked together on and off for like 15 years, in different ways and different spaces. And we also have in common the fact that we are really comfortable in these like liminal spaces, the spaces in between things, navigating and bridging things, because in our backgrounds we're both of mixed ethnicity, and move between languages and between cultural contexts, and in our work very much between cultural contexts and different types of development contexts. Michelle going from local grassroots organizations to negotiating contracts in Canberra, and similarly my end, although perhaps less contact with the spaces I might like. And so you do get used to maneuvering those spaces, within those spaces and deploying things. I think, though, that with this localization idea and how it feels to us, it is, you know, we have to remember the slightly problematic assumptions underneath it, the assumptions that locals aren't already leading development. We're talking about devolution of the top level of power, but we're already leading and making critical decisions. And for me, I guess the story to share is I can't forget our last joint visit to Canberra, being on a panel together with Michelle and talking about, I guess, this kind of devolution of power and localization in the case of women's funds. And someone brought up the oldie but not the goodie joke about the name of our program, Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development, and said, oh, isn't it white women shaping Pacific development? And first I yawned because I've heard it before. It's a very, very old critique, which really no longer applied, and then introduced her around the room to my colleagues. And each one of my colleagues who happened to be in the room were visibly Pacific Islanders, perhaps more so than I appear. And it was so insulting to us because we are shaping development. Thank you very much. We're leading it. Our technical expertise is informing it. It is aligned with our values. It is based on what we believe in and want to do. Yes, there is some devolution of power that has to happen at the highest levels so that the large resourcing decisions are made by Pacific Islanders in a true aid partnership. But localization might hide the fact that it's already very local, brother. We're here and we're doing it. And, you know, let's not forget that fact. There is a lot of important partnerships that already exist at multiple levels between Australians and Pacific Islanders. Sorry, I'll get off the soapbox now, Mark, and give it back to you.
Very well answered, Michelle and Tara. Okay, yeah, we're up against the end of the time. I want to say a big thanks on behalf of everyone to you, Michelle, and to Tara for your wonderful presentations. They were really, really inspiring. Really learnt a lot, and I think, yeah, a lot of things to unpack and think about on our programs more generally for Cardno. So thanks so much for that, and good luck with your respective transitions that'll be ongoing over the next period. Just quickly before I sign off, just a small announcement we wanted to make. Cardno is planning to convene a bit of a working group to discuss some of these localization issues a bit more deeply, and in particular thinking about, I guess, some of the practical tools and approaches we can apply on our programs to support it. So yeah, when we send out the recording in the next couple of days, we'll send a link to let you know if you're interested in hearing more and potentially getting involved in that group. And yeah, won't be not looking for a major time commitment or level of effort, but just, yeah, an opportunity to, yeah, hopefully connect a few of you who are interested and passionate about the topic and want to keep the conversation going. And we'll probably do something similar for the previous project sharing topic, adaptive management, as well. So keep an eye out for that, and let us know if you're interested in being involved. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Michelle. Thanks,
Bye everyone.
Thanks. Bye.